In the freezing grip of winter, 1879, authorities pried open the first grave behind St. Stephen's Church in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, and what they found would haunt the coal region for generations. One coffin, then another, 157 caskets in total, and not a single human body. Instead, each one was packed with stones. Stones, carefully arranged, weighted to match the missing dead, as if someone had crafted a lie and buried it. Church records told an even darker story. Over $300,000 in life insurance payouts. That's the equivalent of millions today. Money collected over 12 years. And not one soul actually laid to rest. So what happened to the people who were supposed to be in those coffins? People who supposedly died peacefully in their beds? Whose families mourned them? Whose funerals were held? The answer wasn't peace. It was something far more chilling. A web of lies. A conspiracy. A network so twisted it reached from the church pulpit to the darkest corners of Pennsylvania's underbelly. And at the center of it all, Reverend Marcus Thompson, a man trusted with salvation, who turned the house of God into a factory for the disappearance of the innocent. Tonight, for the first time ever, the full truth is coming to light. A story buried in shadow. A legacy of betrayal, greed, and stolen lives. The truth about St. Stephen's Church doesn't start in the graveyard. It starts where pain and prayer collided. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, 1867. A place built on coal dust and broken promises. Tucked into the valley of Schuylkill County, this town held around 3,000 souls. Most were Welsh and Irish immigrants, poor, tough, and clinging to hope. They'd left everything behind to chase prosperity in America's booming coal industry. But the coal fields didn't offer dreams. They offered danger. Every day began before dawn with the mournful whistle of the mines, a signal that it was time to descend into darkness. Men vanished into the earth. Many never came back. The evening bell called survivors home, covered in soot, coughing blood, dragging shattered body behind them. And too often, another sound filled the night, the tolling of the funeral bells. Another father gone, another son crushed. Another child buried before they ever had a chance to grow. It was in that pain, that silence, that desperation, that the people turned to faith. And in walked Reverend Thompson, a man who smiled gently, spoke of heaven, and promised peace. But he didn't come to save lives. He came to sell them. It wasn't just cave-ins or explosions that killed the miners of Millbrook. It was the silence, the black lung, creeping in like a ghost day by day, choking them from the inside out. And rising above that pain, just off Elm Street, stood St. Stephen's Episcopal Church, a modest building, red brick, simple steeple, nothing like the grand Catholic cathedral across town, with its soaring towers and stained glass. This church served the Protestant families, mostly English and German, who had come in earlier, waves of immigration. They didn't have the tight-knit safety nets of the newer Catholic communities. No big families to lean on, no mutual aid. And when tragedy struck, as it always did, Protestant widows found themselves completely alone. No one brought casseroles. No one paid their rent. No one helped bury the dead. And that isolation would be the crack in the foundation, the weakness Reverend Marcus Thompson would use to open the door to something far more sinister. He arrived in early 1867, tall, silver-haired, pale blue eyes that could either warm your soul or freeze your blood. He was 45, polished, poised, impeccably connected, ordained in Philadelphia, served in Harrisburg and Allentown. Bishops praised him in letters sealed with gold ink. His wife, Catherine, was just as perfect, hosting socials, reading scripture to the sick, wearing Methodist virtue like a crown. The timing? Chillingly convenient. Just weeks earlier, Reverend William Hayes, the longtime rector, had dropped dead of a heart attack. The congregation was reeling, and the coal mines were entering their deadliest year yet. In his first 6 months, Reverend Thompson performed 14 funerals, more than Hayes had done in his last 2 years. But Thompson didn't just offer prayers. He offered a solution. One crisp October morning, He stood before his congregation, voice booming across the pews. My dear brothers and sisters, I've seen too much suffering, too many widows abandoned, too many children not just orphan of fathers, but of hope itself. He paused, let the silence settle, then delivered the pitch. The Lord calls us to prepare for tomorrow, not just pray for it. And just like that, a church-sponsored life insurance plan was born. The program sounded like a miracle. Affordable premiums, reliable payouts, everything run through a respectable company. Keystone Mutual Assurance of Philadelphia. Families lined up. They believed they were securing their children's futures. But what they didn't know was that they were walking into the darkest scam in Pennsylvania's history. Most insurance companies wouldn't touch coal miners. Too dangerous, too unstable, too likely to die. But Reverend Thompson, he saw an opportunity. While other firms slammed their doors shut, he opened his wide. Through Keystone Mutual Assurance, miners could insure their lives for $500, nearly 2 years. Wages, all for just 50 cents a month. No fine print. No agents breathing down their necks. And if the worst happened, widows received immediate payouts. All it took was a death certificate. No questions asked. No investigations. Just tears and money. It sounded too good to be true. And within just 6 months, over 200 families had signed up. But here's what made Thompson's program unstoppable. It wasn't just convenient. It was personal. When death came knocking, he knocked back. While other companies demanded stacks of paperwork and months of waiting, Thompson promised something else entirely. Speed, compassion, certainty. He told families, I will handle it all. I'll take care of the paperwork. I'll speak to Keystone myself. And if the money takes too long, I'll pay you out of the church fund in advance. People wept with gratitude. They weren't just being insured. They were being rescued. Thompson's operation was more than a ministry. It was a machine. And every machine needs parts. That's where Dr. Cornelius Whitman came in. Fresh from Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, Whitman was young, sharp, eager to make a name, and he saw in Millbrook a chance to build his future. He partnered closely with Thompson, examining the dead, issuing death certificates, and sometimes waiving his fees entirely. The Reverend praised it as Christian charity, but behind that blessing was a business plan. Then came the third man in the Holy Triangle, Samuel Crow, the town's undertaker, and the sexton of St. Stephen's Cemetery. Crow was 50, hair already white, hands stained with the black ink of grief and burial soil. He'd been burying Millbrook's dead for 15 years. Crow offered payment plans for poor families, trusting that Thompson's insurance money would arrive. Soon enough, his service was quiet, dignified, his discretion absolute. Between Thompson's pulpit, Whitman's pen, and Crow's shovel, a perfect system formed. Spiritual guidance, medical legitimacy, final rest. It looked like a miracle, a golden light in a town forever haunted by death. And for a time, it worked. Families felt safe. Miners signed their names, confident that if death came, their children would eat, their wives wouldn't beg, their memory would be honored. It seemed like a godsend. But maybe that's exactly what it was designed to look like. Then, on a bitter February morning in 1868, a man named Thomas McKenna stepped out into the cold and unknowingly walked into the first crack in Thompson's perfect illusion, a crack that wouldn't fully split open for another 11 years. It was just before dawn. The wind howled through the empty streets of Millbrook, and Thomas McKenna was heading in for the early shift at the mine. That's when he saw him, a lone figure, limping along the railroad tracks just outside town, thin, hunched, wrapped in rough, soot-stained work clothes, and walking with a limp McKenna knew like the back of his hand. James Morrison, a fellow miner, a member of St. Stephen's Church, and McKenna's friend. There was just one problem. James Morrison had been dead for 3 weeks. McKenna had been at the funeral. He'd watched the coffin lowered into the frozen ground. He'd wept, and he'd blamed himself, because he'd been there when Morrison was crushed by a falling support beam. working just feet away, too late to warn him. So when McKenna saw that limp again, he froze. "James," he called out. But the man didn't turn, didn't stop, didn't even flinch. By the time McKenna reached the spot on the tracks where the figure had passed, there was nothing, just the early morning mist rising from the tipple, cold and thick like a curtain, and silence. McKenna stood there for a long moment, heart pounding, eyes searching the fog. Then quietly, he told himself what any sane man would. Grief plays tricks. Guilt lies to the mind. And cold dust, well, it could scramble a man's thoughts. So he said nothing. What could he say? That he saw a dead man walking? They'd laugh. Or worse, they'd say the mind had finally broken him. But Thomas McKenna wasn't alone. In the weeks that followed, the whispers began. Other people were seeing ghosts. Maria O'Sullivan swore she saw her late husband, Patrick, buying bread in Centralia, the next town over. Agnes Fletcher claimed her dead son, Benjamin, appeared at her kitchen window one foggy night. He looked older, thinner, but she was sure, absolutely sure, it was him. In every case, the same eerie pattern. The ghosts were seen from a distance, always in neighboring towns. Always looked thinner, more worn down, and they never spoke, never responded. They simply vanished. When chased, they disappeared like mist into mist. Concerned families turned to Reverend Thompson, desperate for answers, and, with his usual poise, he gave them comforting theology. Grief, he preached, has a strange way of keeping the ones we love alive in our minds. The heart creates what it most longs to see. These aren't ghosts, they are visions, gifts from a soul not yet ready to let go. His words were gentle, soothing, and completely wrong, because what was happening in Millbrook wasn't supernatural. It was cold, calculated, and systematic. The truth wasn't in the fog. It was in the files, the names, the insurance claims. And what really happened to James Morrison started on January 15th, 1868, when he walked into Dr. Whitman's office. Alive. January 15th, 1868. James Morrison walked into Dr. Whitman's office, coughing violently, chest aching, struggling to breathe. For miners, these symptoms were tragically common. The telltale sign of pneumoniosis, black lung, the silent killer that stalked the coalface. Whitman examined him thoroughly, listened to his lungs, took notes, and then delivered the blow. It's advanced, too far for treatment. You have weeks, maybe a few months. Morrison was just 34 years old. He had a wife, 3 small children, and a future that had just been stolen. His insurance policy through St. Stephen's Church would pay $500, barely enough to cover the funeral, let alone feed a family, let alone save them. But Whitman didn't close the file. Instead, he locked the door, lowered his voice, and offered a choice. There's another way. The plan was elegant and evil. Morrison would be declared dead of acute heart failure, a diagnosis no one would question. Common, quiet, easy to falsify. Samuel Crow would prepare the body, or rather, the stone-filled coffin. Reverend Thompson would perform the funeral. The community would mourn, and Morrison's family would get their payout within days. Meanwhile, the real James Morrison would be transported out of town, deep into the coal mines of Western Pennsylvania, where labor was scarce. And questions never asked. He'd keep working until his lungs gave out, and no one would ever know. You're dying anyway, Whitman said coldly, like a man ordering paper, not lives. This way, your deaths serve a purpose. Your family eats, and you help power the industry of our great state. He even called it a Christian solution. Morrison sat in silence, a choice no man should have to make. Die slowly, watching his family fall into poverty, or become a ghost, enslaved in the dark so they could survive. He chose what looked like sacrifice. He had no idea it was slavery. And Morrison was just the beginning. The conspiracy was massive, meticulously engineered. Thompson provided the trust, the preacher, the paperwork, the sermons that wrapped lies in scripture. Whitman identified the desperate, sick men on the edge of death, perfect candidates for quiet disappearances. Crow sealed the illusion, crafting fake burials with stone-filled coffins, dirt, flowers, and sobbing. Families none the wiser. Together, they had built a machine, polished, relentless, and completely invisible. No one suspected, because how could they? It all looked so holy. The funerals were flawless. Solemn ceremonies, tearful hymns, stone-filled coffins lowered into the earth, all while the real bodies were nowhere near the cemetery. Instead, a hidden network of labor contractors was already in motion. The dead weren't going to heaven. They were going to hell. Men like James Morrison didn't walk into new jobs. They were dragged into them, in chains. That morning on the tracks, that wasn't a haunting. It was a transfer. He wasn't on his way to freedom. He was part of a human shipment, bound for the black pits of the anthracite mines near Centralia. These mines were the stuff of nightmares. Explosions, cave-ins, walls collapsing without warning. A place where workers died faster than they could be replaced. And the men who ran them, they didn't care. They didn't ask for names. They didn't care about records. They paid Thompson and his partners a flat rate per body, as long as the man could swing a pickaxe. He was bought and sold. No questions asked. And what did the workers get? Nothing. No pay. No contracts. Just moldy food, broken shacks, and a grave waiting somewhere in a rock. They were slaves in everything but name, and most of them would never see their families again. This was the beginning of something darker than anyone could imagine. It would later be known as the Millbrook Method, a cold, calculated process for turning desperation into disappearance, a system designed to transform tragedy into profit, a method that took a house of God and turned it into a marketplace for human souls. Thompson's first test case, James Morrison, proved the system could work. From there, the plan was refined, streamlined, and scaled. What began as a desperate deal with one dying miner became an industrial operation, targeting the sick, the poor, and the broken. And Thompson's brilliance wasn't in the scam. It was in how he chose his victims. He didn't go after strong, healthy men with stable jobs. He went after the ones already drowning, men diagnosed with black lung, workers injured in mine collapses, families neck-deep in debt, breadwinners who could no longer earn. And to them, he offered something that looked like a miracle: immediate insurance payouts, quick money for the family, a second chance if they were willing to sacrifice their name, their freedom, and their future. Meanwhile, Dr. Whitman became even more effective. He had access to everything. He knew who was sick. He knew who was desperate. He knew who was just one paycheck away from collapse. And with that knowledge, he expanded the program's reach. He began mandatory health screenings for every church member enrolled in the insurance plan. He called it preventive care. But in truth, it was a harvesting tool, a cold, smiling process for finding the next man to vanish. Prevention is a cornerstone of good health. Dr. Whitman would say, standing tall in front of the congregation during his regular church seminars. Early detection saves lives and protects families from unexpected hardship. The message sounded compassionate, professional, reassuring, but behind that medical smile, he was collecting intel. The exams were thorough: blood pressure, lung checks, full body assessments. But he wasn't just tracking symptoms. He was mapping vulnerability. Whitman's files didn't just list medical conditions. They included family size, debt levels, employment status, and even social ties. The men he marked weren't just sick, they were isolated, debtors, invisible, men with large families, few friends, and no one powerful enough to ask questions when they vanished. The more invisible you were, the more valuable you became. Meanwhile, Samuel Crow, the town's quiet undertaker and graveyard sexton, was refining his role in the machine. His job? Fake death. Perfectly. With 2 decades of burial experience, Crow knew every detail of how a real body should look, feel, and way. Now, he used that knowledge to build counterfeit corpses. Sawdust, rags, stones, layered with precision to mimic human weight and form. Then came the trick. The coffins were sealed immediately after the family's brief viewing. Why? The body's deteriorating, Crow would explain. The black lung accelerates decay. For your comfort and health, it's best we close the casket now. No one questioned him. And the funerals? They weren't just rituals. They were distractions. Huge services, tear-soaked hymns, overflowing pews, eulogies that pierce hearts and silence minds. Reverend Thompson would deliver devastating sermons, his voice trembling with divine emotion. This man gave everything. For you, for his children, for God. He preached sacrifice, redemption, heaven's hidden purpose. By the time the casket was in the ground, families weren't suspicious. They were too overwhelmed to see the truth. Between 1868 and 1870, 12 more men went through the system. Every case followed the same perfect pattern. 1. Terminal diagnosis or crippling injury. 2. 3. Private consultation with Whitman. 4. 5. Quiet meeting with Reverend Thompson. 6. 7. Stage death. 8. 9. Crow's flawless burial. 10. 11. Emotional funeral. 12. 13. Immediate insurance payout. 14. 15. Silent transport to the mines. 16. They were usually in their 30s and 40s. Old enough to have families, depending on them. Young enough to work for years before collapsing for good. They came from across the Protestant community. Welsh miners, German railroad workers, Irish farmers who had traded plows for pickaxes after their crops failed. Different origins. Same end. What united them wasn't ethnicity. It was desperation. The belief that this was a noble sacrifice. That they were dying for their children. That they were going out as heroes. But none of them realized. They weren't walking into salvation. They were walking into slavery. These men weren't transferred. They were sold into slavery. The mining operations that bought them weren't the big-name companies with rules, safety standards, or inspections. No, these were ghost mines. Hidden in the remote backwoods of western Pennsylvania, operating in legal shadows and powered by one thing, human suffering. They targeted the unstable coal seams, the dangerous, half-abandoned shafts, places so lethal that real companies had already walked away. And into those tombs went the dead. The conditions were beyond brutal. 12 to 16-hour shifts. No ventilation. Air so thick with dust, it sliced the lungs with every breath. They used broken tools, rotting timber supports, and lanterns from another century. Their barracks were overcrowded, disease-ridden, and infested with rats. Food was barely edible. Medicine? Non-existent. Workers dropped like flies. Collapses, cave-ins, crushed limbs, suffocation. But the operators didn't flinch. They just called Thompson, ordered more. And those who survived, they weren't men anymore. They were ghosts in living bodies. Starved, silent, shattered. The work broke their backs. But it was the isolation that broke their souls. Because even if one of them escaped, where could they go? Their families had already buried them, held funerals, collected insurance, moved on. Showing up alive would mean admitting the lie, forcing loved ones to return money they had likely already spent, destroying the very security they died to provide. And so they stayed, chained not by bars but by guilt. This was the cruelest trick of all. The system didn't just imprison the body, it imprisoned the soul. By 1870, the machine was booming. $6,500 in insurance payouts had passed through Thompson's hands, a fortune at the time. And he wasn't just growing richer, he was becoming a legend. Church attendance at St. Stephen's skyrocketed. Families trusted him. Men enrolled eagerly in his insurance program. He preached like a saint and acted like a savior. People worshipped him, not just as a man of God, but as a man of practical wisdom, someone who understood their lives and their fears And what about Keystone Mutual Assurance? Were they suspicious? Not at all. They loved Thompson. His paperwork was flawless. There were no disputes, no red flags. Millbrook, in fact, became one of their most profitable territories. And the company? They didn't ask questions. They just took notes and began recommending Thompson's methods to other agents across the region. They called it customer service. But the very thing that made the system unstoppable would become the reason it collapsed. Because when something grows too big, when it stops hiding and starts spreading, someone eventually notices. By 1871, Reverend Marcus Thompson had built a monster. It was too big, too smooth, too profitable to stay hidden forever. And it was fed by one thing: human misery. What started with one desperate miner was now about to swallow entire families. The system that once looked like salvation would evolve into something closer to mass execution with paperwork. And the darkest chapter of the Millbrook conspiracy was just beginning. Because on a crisp spring morning in 1871, a stranger stepped off the train. His name? Colonel Harrison Blackwood. He wore a tailored suit, carried 2 leather satchels, and walked with the precision of a man who had commanded armies. A veteran of the Civil War turned industrial kingpin, Blackwood was known for one thing: taming the untamable. And he was about to make Thompson an offer that would change everything. Their meeting was quiet, private, held inside the church office beneath a crucifix and stained glass windows that had witnessed too many funerals to count. And Blackwood didn't waste time. "Reverend," he said smoothly, "I represent a consortium of mining operations in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. We've reviewed your methods of labor acquisition, and we're impressed." What he offered wasn't just a bigger order. It was a new level of evil. "We need 500 workers immediately," he said, "and we're prepared to pay premium rates." Let that number sink in. 500 souls. And at $75 per head, triple Thompson's usual cut, the contract would bring in $37,500, more than most ministers made in a lifetime. But that wasn't even the shocking part, because Blackwood wasn't interested in the dying anymore. "We're not just looking for men with one foot in the grave," he continued. "We need healthy workers, men who can give us years of labor." And then he added the line that sent a chill through Thompson's spine: "We're prepared to offer family packages." The math had changed, so had the morality. The machine was no longer about tragic mercy or quiet deathbed choices. It was becoming something else entirely: efficient, cold, industrialized, and scalable. And here's where the story cuts deepest, because in the years that followed, investigators would struggle with one question more than any other. Did Thompson still believe he was doing God's work? Or had he simply discovered that when you wrap evil in scripture, cloak it in charity, and sell it to a community desperate for hope, it doesn't just survive, it thrives? Colonel Blackwood wasn't just buying labor, he was buying entire families. "We're prepared to offer family packages," he said smoothly. "Situations where entire households benefit from relocation, with generous compensation for wives and children." Translation: sell the lie to everyone. Take the healthy, take the strong, take the families, and vanish them together. Thompson understood instantly. This wasn't about faking deaths of the terminally ill anymore. This was recruitment through deception. Tell them they're headed to a better job. Tell their families they're being taken care of. Then stage a death, forge a certificate, ship the man into a mine he'll never leave, all while the family collects a fraudulent insurance payout for a death that never happened. It was slavery, disguised as salvation, packaged as hope, sold like a missionary project. Dr. Whitman hesitated. The man who once falsified death records for dying miners now stared into the abyss of something far darker. He pulled Thompson aside. "Marcus, this is different," he said quietly. "What we've been doing had purpose. We helped real families. We gave peace to the dying." His voice trembled. "But this is something else." And Thompson? He didn't blink. He had changed, transformed. The priest who once preached comfort now spoke like a man possessed by profit and purpose. "Cornelius," he said, "you're thinking too narrowly." His voice carried the same calm authority he used from the pulpit. "These men will be productive. They'll build America's future in new territories. Instead of dying slowly in these played-out mines, they'll be useful. They'll be heroes." He wasn't just rationalizing it. He was believing it. "It's not cruelty," he said. "It's opportunity." It was horrifying, and it was working, because Thompson had become a master manipulator, capable of reframing slavery as virtue, abduction as mercy, and human trafficking as holy work. And what about Samuel Crow, the undertaker who handled the burials? He didn't hesitate for a second. He was already too deep and loving it. The profits were good. But for Crow, it wasn't just business anymore. It was craft. He began refining his art, creating new scripts, new accidental death scenarios, new ways to fool both families and authorities. "We need to vary our causes of death," Crow advised. "Too many heart failures will raise flags." And he had ideas. Mining accidents, house fires, drownings, each with different cover stories, each requiring a unique burial technique, but all ending the same: a family deceived, a worker enslaved, and a check in the bank. The darkness was growing, faster, sharper, hungrier, and the cracks were about to show. It started with one family, the Hendersons, Robert, Sarah, and their two teenage sons, Michael and James. A humble, hard-working household just trying to survive. And they were about to become the first victims of Thompson's family package. Robert was a skilled carpenter, but coal construction was drying up and steady work had vanished. Then one day, Reverend Thompson appeared with an offer that sounded like divine intervention. "We need men like you in Colorado." Thompson said, voice full of faith, "We'll pay up front. You go first. Set up housing. Your family will follow." It sounded perfect. Honest work. A fresh start. A miracle. To make it all official, Thompson arranged for Robert to take out a substantial life insurance policy. It could later be converted into full family coverage, he said. Robert signed, hopeful, grateful, completely unaware he was signing his own disappearance. 2 weeks later, Sarah got the knock on the door. The voice was somber. The story was clear. "There's been a collapse. Robert didn't make it." The letter was official. The payout? $1,000. Enough to ease their grief with security. His body? Too damaged to send home, Thompson explained, but buried with dignity in Colorado soil. Sarah was devastated, but thankful, and she trusted Thompson like a father. So when, 3 months later, he returned with another offer, she didn't hesitate. Before his death, Thompson said, "Robert arranged for you and the boys to join him. He wanted you taken care of." The tickets were ready. The destination? Colorado, they thought. Reality? Nowhere close. They boarded the train, only to be delivered to the mining pits of West Virginia. Not a home, not a new beginning, but a prison camp. No wages, no freedom, no return. And in those same black tunnels, under flickering oil lamps, they found Robert, alive, silent, broken. The Hendersons were never meant to be reunited, but they were, as slaves. This was the birth of family processing, a new system that Thompson crafted. Clean, efficient, final. No loose ends. No grieving widows asking questions. No children accidentally exposing lies. Just one tidy story, and 4 enslaved bodies. Between 1871 and 1875, 43 entire families went through the same process. Gone, wiped from their communities, turned into labor units. And Thompson? He pocketed over $85,000 in insurance payouts, while Blackwood's consortium got nearly 200 new workers, without a single real employment contract. But here's the twist. As the system scaled, so did the risk. Too many disappearances. Too many perfectly tragic deaths. Too many grieving families. that suddenly vanished, and someone was about to notice. The original victims? They were dying, alone, invisible. But now, Thompson was targeting the healthy, the young, the connected, and that created a problem. These people had roots, friends, extended family, lives. They wouldn't just disappear without someone asking. Where'd they go? Thompson needed a new cover story, one big enough, bold enough, holy enough to hide an entire wave of vanishings. And what he came up with was genius and horrifying. He didn't just lie. He created a myth. From the pulpit of St. Stephen's Church, with fire in his voice and a Bible in hand, Thompson made the announcement. The Lord is calling his people to new lands. He invoked Abraham, Moses, the disciples, just as they left everything behind to follow God's call. So too have some of our own chosen to sacrifice comfort for kingdom building. According to Thompson, devout families were joining Christian revival communities in the Western frontier, places of pure faith, biblical living, holy isolation. And if they stopped writing, cut all ties, that's the cost of obedience, Thompson explained. They've chosen God's mission over man's approval. The brilliance? It worked perfectly. When the Hendersons vanished, people didn't panic. They prayed. They've gone west, neighbors whispered, answering the call. Unusual? Yes. But in a post-Civil War America overflowing with revivals, tent preachers, and frontier zeal, it was plausible, spiritual even, and Thompson didn't stop there. To make the illusion bulletproof, he arranged for fake letters, supposedly from the missing families. They came from cities far away, written by hired hands. They described prosperous farming communities, joyful spiritual awakenings, peaceful lives in service of God. Each letter ended the same way. We are well. We are blessed. Please do not worry for us. They were lies, but no one questioned them. In fact, they made the community proud, inspired, even. They believed their own neighbors had become missionaries, modern apostles building Eden out west. But behind the curtain, there were no revivals, no settlements, no blessings, only forced labor, broken backs, and prayers shouted into the dark tunnels of coal mines that never saw the sun. By 1875, Thompson's machine had become something America had never seen before, a religious operation, disguising a criminal empire, built on systematic family destruction. The numbers? Unreal. 120 people vanished. $150,000 in fraudulent payouts. Dozens of labor camps across 3 states. It was no longer a scam. It was a movement, a network of human trafficking, with a cross on the wall and scripture on its lips. But here's the thing. Thompson's greatest strength, his scale, was about to become his greatest weakness. Because when something gets too big, someone always notices. The cracks were forming. The death toll at St. Stephen's had grown too big, too fast, too suspicious. And now, church officials were watching. Insurance investigators were poking around. Law enforcement was circling. But none of them, none, were as dangerous as the people Thompson thought were long gone. Because some of the dead weren't dead at all. They were alive, angry, and planning their escape. And what they knew could shatter everything. The whole operation, a machine built on silence, was about to be exposed by the last person anyone expected. Her name? Rebecca Morrison, a grieving widow, a pillar of the community, a woman who had once been the poster child of Thompson's success. 7 years earlier, her husband James had died in a mine accident. The funeral was touching, the payout generous. Rebecca used it to build a small boarding house, catering to travelers and mine supervisors. People admired her, respected her, saw her as a shining example of what Thompson's program could do for the bereaved. But Rebecca had one habit that set her apart. She read everything. One afternoon in October 1875, she picked up a discarded Philadelphia newspaper left behind by a guest, and there it was, a small story, practically buried, about a tragic mining accident near Centraia. 15 men killed, a routine tragedy. But then, one name made her freeze. James Morrison, aged 38, originally from Schuylkill County. No, it couldn't be. Her James had been dead for 7 years. The age was off by 3 years. But everything else matched. Her heart raced. What if it was a mistake? A coincidence? But her gut, her soul, screamed that it wasn't. So she started digging. She began collecting newspapers from nearby cities. Scrap by scrap, accident by accident, obituary by obituary, and what she found was impossible. Thomas McKenna, dead in 1869, yet working in a mine until 1874. Patrick O'Sullivan, died in 1870, but killed in a completely different mining accident years later. Benjamin Fletcher, heart attack in 1871, but listed as an employee who died in 1875. Not similar names. The exact same man. Men Millbrook had buried, mourned, prayed for. So what was going on? Either the dead were walking, or they'd never been dead at all. Rebecca considered going to Thompson. He was a man of God, her shepherd in grief, the man who'd comforted her when James died. But then she remembered how quick he'd been to dismiss other sightings, how smooth his answers had always sounded, how he never encouraged further questions. So instead, she kept digging. From her boarding house, in secret, she began writing letters to coroners, to mining companies, to newspapers, always posing as a curious, grieving widow, asking innocent questions about men who died from her town. And what she uncovered shattered her world. The Centraia Deep Coal Company confirmed James Morrison had worked for them from March 1868, just 2 months after his funeral in Millbrook, until his actual death in October 1875. He had used an alias, but the employment records matched everything. He was a skilled miner, brought in with a group of workers recruited from eastern Pennsylvania. A group? That's when Rebecca knew. Her James hadn't been the only one. And now, with proof in her hands, she wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. She was the first real threat Reverend Marcus Thompson had ever faced, because Rebecca Morrison had just unearthed a secret that could burn the entire conspiracy to the ground. He'd been paid. He'd lived in company housing. He'd even been buried in the company's own cemetery after a deadly tunnel collapse. James Morrison hadn't just vanished. He'd been alive, working, right under everyone's nose, for 7 years. And the worst part? He wasn't alone. Rebecca started connecting the dots, and the pattern that emerged was horrifying. The names she'd seen carved into headstones in Millbrook, names she remembered weeping over at funerals, were popping up again and again in mining reports, on payroll documents, in death certificates filed years after their supposed burials. They had used their real names. They weren't hiding. They had co-workers, friends, wages, rooms. They weren't dead. And if they hadn't died, then who or what was buried beneath those crosses at St. Stephen's Cemetery? Suddenly, Rebecca was faced with a chilling realization. Either the very concept of death had become unreliable, or no one had been buried at all. She couldn't ignore it any longer. So she made the single boldest decision of her life. On a cold, wind-bitten November night in 1875, Rebecca gathered her brother-in-law, Daniel Walsh, and 2 trusted neighbors. No authorities, no priests, no one tied to the church. They grabbed lanterns and shovels. Their target? James Morrison's grave. It wasn't just personal. It was practical. His grave sat in the newer section of the cemetery, isolated, out of view, and easy to access without drawing attention. They worked quietly, one shovel at a time, their breath rising in misty clouds, their hearts pounding in their ears. What would they find? A body? A desecrated skeleton? Or the unthinkable? And then, thunk, the shovel hit wood. They pried open the coffin and froze. Inside, not a single bone. Stones, sawdust, meticulously packed, carefully arranged, waited to feel like a body. But it wasn't a man. It was a lie in a box. The four of them stood in silence, because what they just uncovered was proof of a massive crime. But now they faced another problem. They had that evidence, but they'd gotten it illegally. Disturbing a grave? That was a felony. They could be arrested, thrown in jail, silenced before anyone ever heard the truth. And that wasn't even the worst part. If Reverend Thompson was in on this, who else was? Dr. Whitman had signed the death certificates. Samuel Crowe had handled the bodies. Local police? Insurance agents? How deep did it go? Was Millbrook just the tip of the iceberg? Rebecca decided. They couldn't go to authorities. Not yet. They needed irrefutable proof. So over the next few weeks, in total secrecy, they dug up 6 more graves. Every single one, the same. Weighted coffins, packed with stones. Not one human bone. And while Rebecca and her allies crept through the shadows with lanterns and truth, Reverend Thompson was starting to feel something was wrong. His perfect system was cracking, and someone was coming for him. Expansion always comes at a cost. And for Reverend Marcus Thompson, that cost was control. The bigger the operation grew, the more families he processed, the more people he needed to lie to watch, to silence. It wasn't just dying miners anymore. Now, whole families were disappearing, and that meant extended relatives in other towns. Cousins, uncles, former neighbors. They started asking dangerous questions. Why haven't we heard from the Hendersons? Why did 3 families vanish the same week? Why does no one ever come back? But those weren't even the most dangerous voices. Inside the labor camps, some of the original victims were still alive, still breathing, still remembering, and some of them were starting to fight back. They'd survived the mines longer than expected. Now, they were organizing, whispers of resistance, plans of escape, and worse, some had succeeded. Free men now walked the coal valleys of Pennsylvania, men who knew everything, names, faces, the truth, and if any of them made it back to Millbrook, Thompson was finished, so he began preparing, not for revival, not for reform, but for what he called, in his private journals, operational conclusion. What did that mean? Burn it all, eliminate the camps, erase the names, destroy the records, and, most chilling of all, silence every voice that knew too much. And there was one voice rising above the rest, the one that terrified him most. Rebecca Morrison. She had evidence. She had witnesses. She had the truth. But Thompson, he had a network, money, and an entire community that still trusted him. It wasn't a matter of if they would collide, only when. And when that collision came, would anyone be left alive to tell the story? It began, as these things often do, with a mistake, a moment of misplaced trust, a hope that the devil might still have a conscience. On a bleak December morning, 1875, Rebecca made a fateful choice. She went to someone she believed could help, someone with authority, someone with ethics, Dr. Cornelius Whitman. She believed, maybe, just maybe, he'd been deceived, that if he learned the truth, he'd help her expose it, correct the record, stop the slaughter. And if he was involved, then at least, she thought, her confrontation would flush him out, and she could prepare. She was wrong, so wrong, about both, because when Rebecca sat across from Dr. Whitman in his quiet little office and opened her journal and laid out everything, the newspaper clippings, the empty coffins, the matching death records, she wasn't unearthing truth. She was signing her own death sentence. "You've made a serious mistake, Mrs. Morrison." That's what Dr. Whitman said. But it wasn't just a warning. It was a sentence. Because within hours of showing him her evidence, the photographs, the forged records, the names of the dead who weren't dead, Rebecca Morrison learned the full scale of the machine she was up against. He didn't even pretend to be surprised. No denial, no confusion, only cold understanding. And then the knock at the door. Reverend Marcus Thompson entered the room. Gone was the gentle shepherd. With him were Samuel Crowe, the undertaker with blood on his hands, and two men Rebecca didn't recognize. Broad-shouldered, silent, predators. They weren't from Millbrook, but it was clear they were here for her. "Rebecca," Thompson said softly, but there was no warmth in his voice now, just a thin, calculated layer of controlled menace. "You discovered something dangerous," he said. "Not just for you, but for everyone. The work we've done here, it serves a greater purpose." He called it divine providence, a necessary evil, the sacrifice of a few for the salvation of many. The same voice he used to deliver sermons now twisted scripture into sin. He spoke of industrial progress, of widows saved, of communities supported. And then he said the most chilling thing of all. "What you call murder, I call mercy." But Rebecca wasn't afraid anymore. She had looked into the grave. She had seen the lies. She had watched the face of the man who buried her husband twist into something monstrous. And now she stood, not as a widow, but as a witness. "You're not serving God," she said, her voice steady. "You're serving yourself. You turned our church into a slaughterhouse, our community into a hunting ground, and our faith into a marketplace for human souls." Silence. Even the hired men seemed unsure now. But Thompson, he didn't flinch. "They would have died anyway," he said. "Black lung, accidents, poverty. We simply redirected their deaths for the greater good." And in that moment, his mask slipped completely. There was no longer a man of God in front of her, only a merchant of flesh. He spoke of $150,000 in insurance payouts, of men worked to death in illegal mines, of families erased in the name of salvation, all said with the calm of a man discussing logistics, not lives. But Rebecca, she didn't back down, because the lie was over. And even if she didn't make out of that room, she had already started fire. "An official letter from your consortium guaranteeing my safety and unhindered return." The room went still. Thompson's fingers twitched slightly, just enough for Rebecca to notice. His polished composure was beginning to crack. "That's quite a list of demands," he said, forcing a calm smile. "You're asking a great deal of trust from us." Rebecca didn't blink. "I'm not asking," she said coldly. "I'm telling you the only way this ends without state police raiding this town by dawn is if you agree." There was a silence heavy enough to stop time. Crow's knuckles whitened. Whitman clenched the strap of his medical bag, and the two unknown enforcers, hardened, brutish men used to solving problems with force, looked to Thompson, awaiting instruction. But the Reverend, he hesitated, for the first time in years, because Rebecca Morrison had done the one thing none of them expected. She planned ahead. "Very well," Thompson finally said. "We'll make arrangements." He smiled again, but this smile was different. It was a smile of a man who knew he was running out of options. Rebecca turned and left the office, her heart pounding in her ears. Every instinct screamed that this wasn't over, that she had just bought herself time, nothing more. But time, she knew, was all she needed, because as of that moment, the shadows had been pierced. The story was already spreading. That afternoon, 2 letters reached the editorial office of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Inside were photographs of 6 open graves, copies of forged death certificates, employment records from Centraia and other mines, a personal account, written in Rebecca's hand, describing the full breadth of conspiracy. The editor paused, stunned by what he was reading. "This can't be real," he whispered, but the evidence said otherwise. And by that night, telegrams were already flying to Harrisburg and Washington, D.C. Anticipated. That very morning, hours before stepping into Whitman's office, she had handed a sealed envelope to Daniel Walsh with instructions. "If I don't come home by sundown, deliver this to the district attorney in Philadelphia yourself. Not by mail, not by message, in person." Inside the envelope, names, dates, photographs, correspondence, maps of mining sites, locations of graves, and a full account of her confrontation with Thompson, written in advance. Rebecca hadn't just discovered the truth, she had weaponized it. So now, in that quiet, desperate moment in Dr. Whitman's office, when Samuel Crowe delivered his cold ultimatum, Thompson understood the unthinkable. He had lost control. He hadn't just failed to silence a witness. He had created a firebrand, and she had lit the match. Rebecca's voice was clear, calm, unyielding. You think you're protecting the community, but you've turned it into a coffin with a steeple. No more secrets, Reverend. No more graves. We're digging everything up, starting now. She turned and walked out, never looking back. By nightfall, she was safely out of Millbrook, and by sunrise the next day, her story was on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer. Headline: Collision Slaves of the Sanctuary. The S.T. Stevens Conspiracy. Exposed collision. Arrests would follow. Exhumations would begin, and what the investigators found beneath the sacred soil of St. Stephen's Cemetery would horrify a nation. Shall I continue with the fallout, the arrests, the trials, and the legacy this case left behind? We're at the climax now, and justice is coming. What you're about to hear is one of the most shocking true stories you've never been told. We're in 1875, a small town, a corrupt pastor, a fake funeral, and a grieving widow who just pulled the ultimate Uno reverse card on the biggest human trafficking ring in U.S. history. This is how one woman took down an entire criminal empire, and all started with her refusing to die. Quietly, clapperboard rolled the madness. As Rebecca Morrison stared down Dr. Whitman in his office, clutching the final piece of evidence against the monsters who stole her husband, something huge was already happening. Direct hit what she didn't know. At that very moment, 2 Pennsylvania State Police investigators were racing toward Millbrook. Summoned by the package she mailed to Harrisburg 3 days earlier. And they weren't alone. They had federal marshals with them, armed, ready, and already investigating reports of slavery in underground mining camps. What happened next? Collision explosion of chaos. Rebecca's confrontation with Thompson was interrupted by the sound of horses' boots and slamming. Carriage doors outside. They were here. And this wasn't just any bust. This was the moment everything unraveled. That December day would go down in history as the start of the largest criminal investigation Pennsylvania had ever seen. The fall of Reverend Marcus Thompson was just the beginning, because what investigators found inside St. Stephen's Church. Skull would haunt the nation. Behind the holy hymns and Sunday sermons was a machine built to enslave, deceive, and destroy. All hidden behind a pulpit. Here's what they uncovered. Notebook Thompson secret journals, hidden in a false compartment inside his office. Inside, backhand index pointing right, a logbook of horror. Real names, fake death causes, insurance payouts, exact mining locations. It was like someone had turned Excel into evil. And what made it even more twisted? Skull and Crossbones, the same hand that wrote those logs, wrote the sermons he preached every Sunday. Open book his journal entries read like scripture for sociopaths. This man's death will feed 4 children. Her grief is the cost of industrial progress. He wasn't just running a crime ring. Brain, he believed he was doing God's work. A divine account in balancing salvation with slavery. And it didn't stop there. Whitman's medical records? Receipt. They expose a methodical system of selecting victims. Ill miners, injured workers, broke families, all evaluated like cattle, and then processed like inventory. But the real gut punch? Police scarlet the camps. Once marshals followed the trail to the remote mining sites, they found what shouldn't exist on U.S. soil. Men chained underground. Families living in prison barracks. Teenagers thought dead, working 16-hour shifts with no pay. Coffins in Millbrook filled with rocks and sawdust. This wasn't just insurance fraud. This was industrial-scale human trafficking, hidden behind choir songs and crucifixes. In total, pushbin 157 confirmed victims. Firecracker hundreds more suspected. Even Captain William McCready, the lead investigator, wrote in his official report, "In 23 years of law enforcement, I've never encountered cruelty so vast and so disguised. But none of this would have been uncovered. Fire without Rebecca Morrison. She wasn't a police officer. She wasn't rich. She wasn't powerful. She was a widow with a bookshelf and a backbone. Her courage exposed a network that had lasted 7 years and nearly got her killed. When the dust settled, Locke Thompson, sentenced to life. Locke Dr. Whitman, prison for conspiracy, malpractice, and fraud. Locke Samuel Crowe, hanged in 1878 after being convicted of murder in connection to a labor camp accident. And Rebecca, she lived to see it all burn. Collision, so here's the takeaway. One woman, one newspaper article, one unanswered question. How is my dead husband working in mine? Turned into the biggest criminal takedown in Pennsylvania history. If this doesn't deserve a movie, I don't know what does. Smash that like button if Rebecca Morrison is officially the OG whistleblower. Comment Justice for Millbrook if you made it this far, and subscribe for more real stories that hit harder than fiction. This isn't just history. Backhand index pointing right, it's a reminder. Even in the darkest places, one spark can start a revolution. Police Scarlight, what the investigators found next, was straight out of a nightmare. This wasn't just a conspiracy. It was a blueprint for hell. Let's start with Dr. Whitman. Behind his white coat and healing hands was a man running calculations, not for cures, but for profit. File folders, patient files. They didn't just list illnesses. They listed money-bag insurance policy values, linked social ties or lack thereof, broken heart, psychological vulnerabilities, hammurapic labor potential, enforced mining, scribbled in his own handwriting, high value target, low chance of being missed, ideal for extraction. This wasn't a doctor. This was a predator in a lab coat. But then they raided Samuel Crowe's workshop, and what they found, exploding head, you're not ready for this. It was a factory for faking death. Instructions for building bodies out of rags, sawdust, and stones. Wrench custom tools for sealing coffins immediately after viewings. Package letters from suppliers providing materials for these fake burials. He even had blueprints for designing grief. Imagine discovering that every coffin in your churchyard might just be a sawdust dummy in a wooden box. That's the world they were living in. But the biggest shock? Locomotive was waiting hundreds of miles away. Investigators launched joint operations with state authorities in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio to track down the missing. They followed every fake death, every buried lie, straight to mines of hell. And what they discovered, police Scarlight 14 mining camps, hammurapic illegal or barely legal operations, skull working conditions straight from the days of antebellum slavery. We're talking locked men locked in at night, spoon minimal food, faced with medical mask, no medical care, collision 12 to 16-hour shifts underground, cross-mark no pay, just survival. But here's the twist no one saw coming. Some of Thompson's dead men were still alive. Warning, I repeat, they were alive. Rescue teams raided those mines like something out of a movie. And when the dust settled, pick 87 survivors were pulled from the darkness. But they weren't just workers. They were broken, malnourished, barely able to walk. Many hadn't spoken to another human in months. Some didn't even believe rescue was real. They thought it was a trap, brain because the psychological abuse was off the charts. Here's how they were controlled. Broken Heart told their families believed they were dead. Balance Scale warned that if they returned home, they'd be arrested for fraud. Prohibited cut off from outsiders. Brick kept apart from each other, so they could never organize or rebel. They weren't just physically trapped. They were emotionally and mentally enslaved. But now, get ready, because among the survivors, eyes one name silenced the room. James Morrison. Yes, Rebecca's husband, the very first victim. He had been missing for 7 years and 11 months, forced to work underground, convinced the world had forgotten him. Until now, his reunion with Rebecca, collision was captured in photographs, scroll covered in newspapers, droplet and brought entire courtrooms to tears. That one moment became the emotional epicenter of the entire case. The final proof that love, truth, and one relentless widow could bring down even the most evil of empires. White heavy checkmark, stay tuned, because what happened after that courtroom reunion was even more shocking. And trust me, you won't believe how this ends. After the mind raids and emotional reunions, the story exploded. The headlines? Loudspeaker, widow exposes human trafficking ring. Loudspeaker, Church of Death on trial. And what came next? Collision, one of the largest legal showdowns in American history. We're talking from main conspirators, 37 associates, over 200 witnesses, thousands of documents, nearly a decade of hidden crimes. Police scarlet the charges? Brace yourself. Insurance fraud, kidnapping, involuntary servitude, conspiracy to commit murder, and a Rico-sized web of evil. And at the center of it all, performing arts Reverend Marcus Thompson, the preacher turned predator. His defense team tried to spin it like a redemption arc. Open book, he was just trying to help grieving families. Package, he didn't know what was happening in the mines. But prosecutors? Oh, they came locked and loaded. Fire, they dropped Thompson's own journals like a nuke in the courtroom. And in them, the Lord works in mysterious ways. These men sacrifice their comfort so that their families may prosper. Their suffering serves eternal purposes. Yeah, he knew. He planned it, and he justified it with religion. This wasn't ignorance. This was calculated horror, disguised as hope. Next up, Dr. Cornelius Whitman. He tried the "I was tricked" card, said he thought the program was legit. But no, evidence showed he had visited the mines. He had walked the tunnels. He had suggested changes, not to help the men, but to make them work harder. Speech balloon, more calories for peak productivity, he'd written. Not one word about their safety. Not one word about their freedom. He wasn't a doctor. He was an engineer of human suffering. Then came the Undertaker doom. Coffin Samuel Crow. Crow didn't deny it. Ice Cube, I was following orders, he said coldly. He gave full breakdowns. How he built fake corpses. How he arranged funerals. How he manipulated grieving families. How he made sure no one ever opened a coffin. And in return for his cooperation, hourglass not done, he got a lighter sentence, but left the courtroom as the most chilling man in the entire case. After months of testimony and endless evidence, the jury returned. Firecracker guilty on all counts. Axe Reverend Thompson. Life in prison at Eastern State Penitentiary. He died behind bars in 1891, still claiming, in his final letters, that he was doing God's work. Dr. Whitman, 25 years, served 18, died of tuberculosis in 1894. Skull Samuel Crow, 15 years, released in 1889, then vanished off the face of the earth. Gone. Balance scale, the Thompson trials weren't just a courtroom drama. They were a reckoning. The biggest forced labor operation in American history, uncovered by one widow who refused to be silenced. Rebecca Morrison didn't just expose a crime. She wrote herself into history. And that is how you destroy an empire with nothing but the truth. This case didn't just shock America, it changed it forever. Because after Reverend Thompson and his gang went down, something incredible happened. Scroll laws started changing. Balance scale, rules got rewritten. And the reason? Collision, one widow with the truth, cracked the biggest forced labor conspiracy in U.S. history. First, the insurance industry got rocked. Receipt new laws demanded independent death verifications. Calendar mandatory waiting periods before payouts. Police scarlet, no more quick claims based on sketchy paperwork. If someone died, now it had to be proven. No more empty coffins. No more graves full of rocks. Then came the mining industry. Bomb, the government cracked down hard. New federal laws were passed to protect workers, enforce safety, and ban any system even close to forced. Labor, the underground world Thompson had built, prohibited, wiped off the map. But for Millbrook, the scars ran deeper than any reform. Because this wasn't just a crime. This was a betrayal of faith, of family, of everything the community believed in. Crying-faced families had mourned, had buried loved ones, had cried in church pews, only to learn that their grief, money with wings, was sold for profit. And for those who got paid insurance money, it felt even worse. They had bought homes, built businesses, paid for their kids' schooling, all from money they now knew came from fraud. They weren't criminals. They'd been tricked. But the guilt, it never left. Some gave the money back. Others shut down their businesses. The shame ripped families apart for generations. Synagogue for St. Stephen's Church, it never recovered. Attendance dropped like a rock. From hundreds of faithful to just 30. By 1879, it was sold to the Catholic diocese. The church that once promised salvation, skull became a symbol of silence, sin, and deception. Even the cemetery became a battleground. Families didn't know who was really buried there, and who was just stones in a box. Many spent small fortunes exhuming loved ones. Others just moved graves to different towns, too haunted by doubt to ever visit again. But through all the pain, one name stood tall. Fire Rebecca Morrison, the woman who started it all. She became a national hero. Her story was printed in papers from coast to coast. Raised fist, she met with lawmakers, spoke at national conferences, scroll pushed for insurance reform, broken heart, and helped other victims of trafficking find justice. Until her death in 1923, she never stopped fighting. Today, law enforcement academies still study her case. Textbooks still teach the conspiracy she exposed. And those empty coffins, they're more than evidence. They're a warning that the worst crimes don't always hide in darkness. Sometimes they hide in the pulpit, disguised as hope, fueled by trust, and executed in plain sight. Clapperboard, the craziest part? This should have never happened because people saw things. People reported things. They said, I saw Thomas McKenna, alive. I swear Patrick O'Sullivan walked past my store. I just saw Benjamin Fletcher buying coal. But what did they get? You're just grieving. It's a hallucination. People in mourning see strange things. No one listened. No one believed them. And while they doubted the brokenhearted, warning, a full-blown slavery ring was growing in plain sight. Religious leaders, doctors, undertakers, all cloaked in respect, power, and untouchable trust. And they used it to bury the truth, literally. So what was the final body count? Scroll 157 confirmed victims. Moneybag $847,000 in fraudulent insurance payouts. Over $20 million in today's money. Hundreds of workers trafficked across state lines. Broken heart families destroyed. Brain communities traumatized. Folded hands in faith and religious authority shattered. But what sent real chills through investigators? It wasn't the crimes. It was what Thompson said at the end. In court, after his conviction, to everyone watching, he stood there, no remorse, no shame, and said, loudspeaker, I have served God's purpose in ways others cannot understand. Those men built America's industry. Those families were saved from poverty. Our methods were efficient, and history will vindicate us. Flushed face, let that sink in. Even after being exposed, after the coffins were found empty, after survivors were rescued, Thompson still thought he was a hero. He didn't just justify evil. He believed it was divine. He wrote sermons with one hand and shipping orders for enslaved workers with the other. And that right there, warning, is the most terrifying part. Because when someone wraps evil in good intentions, when they turn murder into ministry and slavery into salvation, they're not just dangerous. They're unstoppable until someone like Rebecca Morrison comes along. Crossed swords, she didn't just uncover crimes. She exposed how evil hides in the open, inside trusted roles, inside sacred walls, inside communities that never thought to question authority. Collision. And that's why this story matters. Because the next Thompson, he won't wear a black robe. He might wear a lab coat, a collar, a badge, a business suit. He might start a charity or a megachurch. or a wellness movement. But if there's one thing this story proves, Brain, it's that evil thrives when we stop asking questions. So now I want to ask you, globe showing Europe, Africa, do you think this kind of thing could still happen today? Could a powerful figure, hiding behind a holy title or good intentions, still fool an entire community? Eyes drop your thoughts in the comments. Mobile phone with arrows, smash that like button if the story shocked you. Speech balloon, share it with someone who needs to hear this. Bell and subscribe for more insane, true stories that were almost buried in history forever. Because the most powerful stories are the ones someone prayed you'd